The wind slid like knives between the tall buildings, carrying the bitter sting of winter across the near-empty streets of New York. Snow fell slow, a soft blanket muffling the usual roar of the city until even footsteps seemed hushed. A single street lamp flickered above a bus stop, its weak light glowing against the storm, throwing long shadows across the bench where Henry sat hunched, his body folded into itself for warmth, his olive jacket, frayed at the cuffs and thin by years of use, barely held back the cold. In his arms he clutched a worn manila folder, pressed tight to his chest as though the thin cardboard might shield him from more than the weather. Inside, 5 resumes lay limp and creased, each one marked by rejection. He had sent dozens before, stood in lines at job fairs, and still no one wanted a 46-year-old widower with gaps in his work history. Henry exhaled, watching his breath fog in the air before vanishing. For a moment he allowed himself to look at the snow piling against his boots. He thought of his son, Noah, now living in a foster home where there was likely heat, food, and a bed with real blankets. It should have been a comfort, but instead it hollowed him further. He remembered promising, voice thick with tears, just for now, I'll come back for you. The words echoed in his head louder than the wind. He shifted on the bench, the cold gnawing through his jacket, when the sharp click of heels cut through the storm. Henry lifted his head. A woman approached, walking fast but faltering, her arms tied around her body. Snow clung to her hair, wet strands sticking against her face. She looked polished, someone from a higher floor office building, dressed in a neat skirt and blouse, but without a coat. She looked exposed, her skin raw against the biting air. She stopped beneath the same awning, her shoulders trembling, hands rubbing against each other in a useless attempt to stay warm. Henry dropped his eyes, staring at the folder on his lap. She wasn't like him. She probably had an apartment with heat, a kitchen with food. She would ride the bus somewhere warm, safe. While he went back to the cracked leather seat of a rusted truck, he told himself not to care. But the wind howled through the stop, a sudden gust that made her flinch, and he found himself glancing at her again. Her lips were pale, fingers stiff. The jacket wasn't much, old, patched, thin, but it was all he had. He could keep it, stay silent, be like everyone else, or he could give it away. Henry stood slowly, the cold immediately crawling over his arms. He shrugged off the coat and held it out to her. She blinked, startled. You don't have to do that, she said, her voice small, fogging in the air. Henry gave her a tired smile. I've already lost enough today. This coat is the only thing I have left to give. Her eyes softened, torn between refusal and need. But you need it more than I do. Maybe, he said gently, stepping closer, but not tonight. Before she could argue, he draped the jacket across her shoulders. The fabric sagged on her, heavy, smelling faintly of soap and coffee. She pulled it tighter without meaning to, her body sinking into the borrowed warmth. She looked at him, something unspoken flickering in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Henry only nodded, folding his bare arms across his chest. The snow continued to fall, wrapping the silence between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she turned slightly toward him. What's your name, Henry? I'm Claire, she said. Nice to meet you, Claire. She shook her head faintly. You shouldn't have given me your jacket. Probably not, Henry admitted with the faintest smile. But I couldn't just let you freeze. The growl of an engine broke the stillness as headlights cut through the snow. The bus slowed, brakes hissing, doors folding open with a squeal. Claire took a step forward, then stopped, fumbling in her purse. She pulled out a small card and held it to him. In case you ever need anything. Henry accepted it, slipping it into his folder. Without looking, people said things like that all the time. Most didn't mean it. Claire climbed the steps, pausing once more to glance back. The jacket wrapped around her like armor. Then the bus pulled away, swallowed by the storm. Henry stood alone, shivering, not from the cold, but from something else. Something he couldn't name. He tilted his head back, watching snow blur the streetlight until the world seemed softer, quieter. His lips moved in a whisper. The words carried off into the night. Maybe tomorrow. Then he turned, walking slowly down the empty street, the cold pressing close, but the memory of warmth still lingering. The bus rattled down the avenue, its headlights carving through the snow. But inside the warmth was thin. The heater groaned like an old man, barely keeping the windows from frosting over. Marvin, the driver, kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the worn lever at his side. He'd driven this route for 20 years, watching the city change through his windshield like a film that never stopped rolling. He knew every stop, every regular, every stranger who drifted in for a night then vanished back into the storm of life. But tonight was different. He had seen it, clear as day. The man at the bus stop with eyes that carried too many winters, taking off his coat when he had no spare to give. Marvin had caught it in the rearview mirror as Claire walked toward the back. Henry still outside, his arms bare, the snow lashing him. It wasn't just kindness, it was the kind of sacrifice Marvin hadn't seen in years. He drove on, but the image burned into him. At the next red light, Marvin glanced into the mirror again. Claire sat in the last row, jacket pulled close, her face half hidden in shadow. She wasn't scrolling on her phone or staring blankly like most passengers. Instead, her gaze was turned inward, fixed on something no one else could see. He tapped the wheel, curiosity prickling in him, when he finally pulled into the depot. Claire rose and stepped down, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. She glanced once at Marvin, as if she might say something, then disappeared into the night. The doors hissed shut. Marvin rubbed his jaw. He didn't know her, but something told him she carried more power than her fragile figure showed. And that man Henry was the kind Marvin didn't forget. At home, hours later, Marvin set down his keys on the chip counter. His daughter, Sophia, was at the kitchen table, bent over her sketchbook, 16, all sharp lines and soft eyes. She lived more in her drawings than in the real world. Her pencils whispered across the paper, shadows and shapes coming alive under her touch. "You're late," she said without looking up. Storm slowed everything. Marvin answered, pulling off his boots. He hesitated, then poured himself a cup of coffee that was more burnt than fresh. He leaned against the counter, watching his daughter. "What are you drawing this time?" She turned the page to show him a man sitting on a bench under a streetlight, shoulders hunched, folder clutched in his lap. His jacket was stretched over. Another figure, a woman, faceless, but wrapped tight in borrowed warmth. Marvin froze. "Where'd you see that?" Sophia shrugged. "You told me once, about people you notice. I just imagined." Marvin stared at the sketch. The likeness was uncanny. Henry's tired eyes, his hands too thin from hunger, the stoop of a man carrying more weight than anyone should. It was all there, captured by someone who had never seen him. Astra's strange thing, soft. Marvin said quietly, "I saw that tonight. That man gave up his coat for a stranger." Sophia's pencil paused. She looked up, eyes wide. "So he's real?" Marvin nodded slowly, "as real as they come." She leaned closer over the drawing, her breath shallow. "What happens to men like that, Dad?" Marvin didn't answer right away. He thought of Henry's thin arms, of the way the snow bit into his skin, of the way the world forgot men like him too easily. Finally, Marvin sighed. "Most of the time, nothing. They just fade. But sometimes, if the world's paying attention, things change." Sophia closed her sketchbook, pressing her hand flat on the cover. "Then I hope the world is watching him." Marvin studied her face, the seriousness in her young eyes. It shook him, how much hope she carried when his had thinned. With years of disappointment, he didn't know why, but he felt the pull of Henry's story in his bones, as though tonight had started something that wouldn't end quietly. As he switched off the kitchen light and the apartment sank into shadow, Marvin whispered to himself what he hadn't said to his daughter. "I hope so." Asterisk far across the city. Henry sat in his rusted truck, the card Claire had given him resting on the dash. He hadn't even read the name yet. He stared at it under the faint glow of the streetlight, heart thudding as though the small rectangle of paper carried more weight than he could bear. He almost picked it up, almost dialed. Instead, he turned his head to the photograph of Lily and Noah tucked beside the visor. "Maybe tomorrow," he muttered again, shoving the card back into his folder, unaware of the storm of lives already circling closer to his own. The city slept under its blanket of snow, but the night had begun to weave its threads. 3 strangers, bound by one moment at a bus stop, would soon find themselves pulled into a story none of them could have imagined. Snow melted into slush by morning, and New York shook itself awake, the roar of traffic and horns breaking the silence that the storm had carved the night before. But in a small apartment 3 floors above a laundromat, Sophia sat cross-legged on her bed, sketchbook spread open across her knees. The man she had drawn last night stared back at her from the page. His eyes weren't just sad, they were searching, desperate, alive in a way that unsettled her. She traced the lines with her finger, the folds of his worn jacket now draped across a faceless woman. The more she looked, the more she felt like she had pulled him out of the storm for a reason. When her father shuffled it with his coffee, she snapped the sketchbook closed, but Marvin noticed. He always noticed. Still working on that bus stop. Drawing? He asked gently. It's not just a drawing, Sophia replied. He looked like someone who could disappear if no one cared enough to see him. Her voice cracked a little. And I don't want him to disappear. Marvin studied her for a moment, weighing whether to share more. Sophia, that man gave away the only jacket he had last night. Not many people do something like that. Maybe he's stronger than he looks, but as he said it, Marvin couldn't shake the memory of Henry's thin arms shaking against the cold. Strength had its limits. Across the city, Henry moved like a shadow through the crowded lobby of a job fair downtown. His boots left wet prints on the marble floor, his folder tucked tight beneath his arm. Dozens of booths lined the hall, banners shouting promises of opportunity. But each time Henry handed over his resume, he saw the same glance at his age, the same polite rejection masked in corporate words. By noon, his papers were smudged with damp, his hope thinner than his coat. As he stepped outside, snow began to fall again, light but steady, clinging to the edges of his hair. He bent to gather his folder, the resume slipping from his grip into the slush. He cursed under his breath, trying to save them before they soaked through. When he looked up, a familiar face stood watching him. Claire. She was dressed differently. Now, wrapped in a tailored coat, heels no longer raw against the street. Her hair was dry, neatly pinned, her presence sharp in the way of someone used to commanding rooms. Yet in her eyes lingered the memory of the night before. You, she said softly. Henry straightened, clutching the soggy papers to his chest. Shame burned through him. The last thing he wanted was for her to see him like this, drenched, desperate, exposed. I didn't think you'd remember, he muttered. Claire stepped closer, her gaze locked on his. You gave me warmth when I had none. I remember that. She hesitated, then tilted her head. But why didn't you call me? Henry stiffened. The card, it was still buried in his folder. He hadn't even looked at it. People give out cards all the time. Doesn't mean anything, he said flatly, trying to end the conversation before it revealed too much. Claire studied him for a long moment, the weight of her silence pressing against him more than her words. Finally she said, sometimes it does. She reached into her purse and pulled another card, pressing it into his hand with more force this time. Don't waste it, Henry. Then she turned and walked into the crowd, her heels fading into the noise of the city. Henry stood there, heart thudding, the damp card in his hand trembling. He looked down. Embossed letters gleamed against the wet paper. Claire Reynolds, CEO. Reynolds Architectural Group. The name struck him like a blow. He knew that company. Years ago, his own firm had collaborated on a hospital project under their designs. Back when he was Henry Miles, structural engineer, not the man scraping for work outside a job fair. For a moment, hope flared in, then fear smothered it. What would a CEO want with a man who slept in a truck and handed out resumes no one read? He stuffed the card back into his folder, but the damage was done. The seed of possibility had taken root, and he couldn't shake it. That night, Marvin drove his usual route, headlights carving tunnels through the dark. When the bus doors folded open at one stop, Henry climbed aboard, shoulders hunched, folder still clutched like a lifeline. Marvin's eyes flicked to him in the mirror, recognition sparking. Fares to dollars, Marvin said, then paused. Something in him shifted. He slid the lever and waved his hand. Forget it, rides on. Me tonight. Henry blinked. Why? Marvin shrugged. Call it a driver's choice. He gave a half smile. Besides, my daughter already drew you. You're kind of a celebrity in my house. Henry froze. Drew me? Marvin nodded. Sketch of you under a streetlight. Said you looked like someone worth remembering. Henry's throat tightened, his eyes burning as if the storm outside had reached him inside. No one had said that about him in years. He lowered himself into a seat, staring at his calloused hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't forgotten him. And yet, deep in his chest, a gnawing suspense took hold. Claire's name, Sophia's sketch, Marvin's quiet kindness, they weren't coincidences. Something was building around him, and he couldn't tell if it would save him or destroy him. Asterisk, the city wore a gray coat that afternoon, the kind of sky that pressed low, as if the heavens themselves were tired. Henry moved through the streets with his head down, folder clutched tight against him. The damp from yesterday's snow still curling the edges of his resumes. Each step felt heavier than the last. He had grown used to rejection, but today, it clung differently. Maybe it was the way Claire had looked at him. Maybe it was the weight of her name on that business card. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in months, he had dared to believe that someone had actually seen him. He ducked into the public library, his usual refuge. The heat was uneven, but at least it was warmer than the streets. Rows of books towered around him, shelves that smelled of paper and dust. He found an empty table near the corner, spreading out his resumes and scribbling small adjustments with a borrowed pen. He could almost hear Lily's voice teasing him gently, "You rewrite the same words over and over." Henry, maybe it's not the paper that needs to change. He rubbed his eyes, trying to quiet the ache in his chest. Across town, Claire sat in her glass-walled office, the city skyline stretching behind her like a painting. The jacket Henry had given her lay draped over the back of her chair. She had meant to return it, but when she touched it, she remembered the heat of his kindness that night. It smelled faintly of soap, faintly of survival. She couldn't let it go just yet. Her assistant, Mark, tapped on the door, slipping a file onto her desk. "We're finalizing partners for the new community center build. Do you want to review?" Claire nodded absently, but her eyes were already scanning the list of proposed contractors. And there, buried halfway down the page, was a name, Miles Engineering. Her hand still. Henry Miles. The name rang a bell deep in her memory. Years ago, before her promotion, she had attended a ribbon cutting for a children's hospital. The structural work had been flawless, praised for its design and safety. She remembered the man credited for it, Henry Miles, structural engineer. Could it be the same man she'd seen on the street, clutching resumes like lifelines? She leaned back in her chair, tension coiling through her. If it was him, then the city had failed him, and she hated when talent was wasted, when good men were broken by a system too blind to notice them. Asterisk, that night, Henry boarded Marvin's bus again, exhaustion dragging at his shoulders. Marvin gave him a nod through the mirror, as if they shared a quiet secret. Halfway through the ride, Marvin said, "My daughter's sketch, she hasn't stopped working on it. Says your eyes don't leave her alone." Henry chuckled weakly, though it sounded closer to a sob. Strange thing, being remembered by a stranger. Marvin's voice softened. Sometimes strangers are the only ones who notice. When Henry stepped off the bus, Marvin watched him go, a heaviness in his chest. He had seen too many passengers fade into the city like ghosts. Something about this man gnawed at him, as if fate had set Henry at his stop for a reason. 2 days later, Claire made a decision. She visited the library herself. Her assistant thought it odd, but she brushed him off. She walked between rows of shelves until she spotted him at a corner table, bent over papers that had seen better days. He hadn't noticed her yet. His hands moved slowly, rewriting lines that no one seemed to want to read. "Henry," she said, softly. He looked up, startled. For a moment, embarrassment washed across his face, then suspicion. "What are you doing here?" "I came to return this." She set the jacket on the table, neatly folded, as though it were a treasure. "But I also came because I know who you are." Henry's jaw tightened. "You don't know me." Asterisk, Claire sat across from him, unflinching. "Henry Miles, structural engineer. You built the foundation of St. Matthew's Children's Hospital. I was there. I remember the way people praised your work." His eyes dropped to the table, shame mixing with a spark of something dangerous hope. "That was a long time ago, and it doesn't erase what you did," Claire pressed. "You mattered then, and you still matter now." Henry shook his head. "People don't hire men who sleep in trucks." His voice cracked, raw. "They don't care about who I was." Claire leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Then maybe they should, and maybe I'm in a position to change that." For a moment, the library around them fell away, just the two of them locked in a silence brimming with possibility. But Henry pulled back, wary. "Why would you help me?" Claire hesitated. She could have said it was gratitude, or pity, or business sense. Instead, she said the truth. "Because the night you gave me your jacket, you reminded me of something I had forgotten, that people are worth more than their titles, and I don't intend to forget it again." Henry stared at her, the storm inside him raging. Part of him wanted to believe. Another part feared this was just another cruelty disguised as kindness. As Claire left him with her card again, Henry sat frozen. He didn't know if calling her would save him or expose him further. All he knew was that something bigger than both of them was moving now, a current pulling him forward, whether he was ready or not, and somewhere across the city. Sophia added the final line to her sketch. The man under the streetlight now had eyes, lit not with despair, but with a flicker of fire. She closed the book and whispered, almost as if she knew, "Don't disappear." Asterisk, the storm had eased, but the city was no kinder. Wind funneled through the avenues, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter and the restless energy of 1,000 lives, rushing past one another. For Henry, the streets felt louder, harsher. Every honk, every hurried footstep reminded him of his own stillness, the way his life had stalled while the world sped on. He walked with his folder pressed under his arm, the edge of Claire's card digging into the papers like it wanted to be noticed. He had not called her. He could not yet. The weight of shame was heavier than the weight of hope that evening. When the bus pulled up at the corner near the warehouse, Marvin was at the wheel. He saw Henry right away, standing in the dim light, snow dusting his shoulders. There was something in the man's posture that struck him, a weariness so deep it bent his back, but not enough to break it. Marvin opened the doors, and when Henry hesitated, Marvin waved him in. "Rides on me," Marvin said simply. Henry frowned. "You can't keep doing that. They'll notice." "Let them," Marvin replied, his voice low but firm. "Some rules are worth breaking." Henry stepped inside, the doors folding shut behind him. The bus was nearly empty. The few passengers sunk into their coats, eyes glazed with the fatigue of the day. Henry slid into a seat near the front, folder balanced on his lap, his fingers tapped nervously against it, the sound muffled by the rumble of the bus. Marvin glanced at him in the mirror. "My daughter wants you to see something," he said after a long pause. Henry looked up, confused. Marvin reached into the side pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He passed it back to Henry when the bus came to a stoplight. Henry unfolded it, and the breath caught in his throat. It was the sketch, the one Sophia had drawn. It was him, sitting beneath the flickering street lamp, shoulders hunched, jacket stretched across a faceless woman. But the detail, God, the detail. His eyes looked haunted, searching, almost pleading. Yet there was something else there too, a stubbornness, a refusal to give in entirely. Henry's hands trembled as he held the drawing. "She's never met me," he whispered. Marvin shook his head. "No, but she sees people, always has. She told me you looked like someone who mattered, even if the world forgot." Henry pressed the paper to his chest for a moment, his throat thick. No resume, no polite rejection had ever seen him like this. He had become invisible in his own city, but here, in the lines of a girl's pencil, he was undeniable. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked finally. Marvin's eyes met, his in the mirror. "Because sometimes a picture tells you what words can't. You think you're finished, Henry, but my daughter drew you like a man still waiting for his turn. Maybe she knows something you don't." The bus rolled on, carrying them through the arteries of the city, neon lights flashing against the windows. Henry stared at the drawing until the edges blurred with tears. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen not by pity, but by truth. Later, when Marvin parked the bus at the depot, Henry lingered. The night was colder, the air sharp with frost, but he wasn't ready to step back into it. Marvin came down the aisle, his coat collar turned up. "I don't know your whole story," he admitted, "but I know a crossroads when I see one. That card in your folder is not just a piece of paper. It's a door. You going to knock, or you going to freeze out here forever?" Henry opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. Marvin gave a small nod, as if he expected that. "My daughter believes in you already. Maybe you should try believing in yourself." He pressed the sketch back into Henry's hands. "Take it. A reminder." Henry stepped off the bus, the drawing tucked safely in his folder alongside Claire's card. The night swallowed him, but something pulsed inside him now, fear. Yes, but also a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire sat at her desk long after her staff had gone home. The jacket he had given her was draped over the back of her chair again, and she found herself staring at it. In her mind, Henry's face wouldn't leave her. The man at the bus stop was not just a stranger. He was Henry Miles, a name once spoken with respect in the halls of her industry. She opened her laptop and searched old archives. Articles surfaced. Engineer Henry Miles leads design of city's new hospital wing. Photographs showed him, younger, smiling, with a woman and boy by his side, Lily and Noah. Claire's throat tightened as she clicked through the pages, realizing how far he had fallen. A storm of conflict rose in her chest. She was a CEO. She made decisions with logic, not emotion. But when she thought of him giving her his only jacket without hesitation, logic had no place. And so, while Henry stared at the sketch in the back of his truck, and Marvin told his daughter that some people were worth watching out for, Claire made a choice that would change all their lives. She picked up her phone and dialed a number that would set events in motion. Neither she nor Henry could stop. The world had noticed Henry at last, and the quiet kindness of one night at a bus stop was about to ripple into something far more powerful and far more dangerous than any of them imagined. The call came just after dawn. Henry was awake already, though awake hardly mattered when sleep came in broken scraps. Stolen in the cold back seat of his truck, he rubbed his arms beneath the thin blanket when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. People like him didn't get phone calls that mattered, but something, maybe the memory of Claire's car digging into his folder, made him swipe the screen. Henry Miles, the voice asked. Clear and steady. He hesitated. Who's asking? It's Claire Reynolds, she replied. We met at the bus stop. I'd like to talk. In person. Henry's chest tightened. He could hear faint office noise behind her voice, the hum of phones, the click of keyboards. She was already moving in a world he no longer belonged to. Look, he muttered. I'm not the man you think I am. I think you're exactly the man I saw, Claire said firmly. Meet me in my office at noon. Please don't say no. The line went dead. Henry sat frozen, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. The city outside was waking, engines growling, footsteps rushing. Noon. That gave him 5 hours to decide whether to step into her world or retreat further into his. He found himself walking aimlessly, folder under his arm, until he ended up at the bus stop again, the same one where the storm had nearly swallowed him. And when the bus arrived, Marvin was there, hands on the wheel, eyes finding Henry in the mirror. You look like a man carrying a storm inside, Marvin said as Henry climbed aboard. Henry dropped into a seat. She called me. Wants to meet. Marvin arched an eyebrow. The woman with your jacket. Henry nodded. She's important. More important than someone like me should even be near. Asterisk important doesn't mean untouchable, Marvin replied, and maybe she sees something you don't. He paused, then added, take the sketch. My daughter finished it last night. Said you need it today. Henry pulled the folded paper from his folder. The drawing had changed. Sophia had added lines of light around him, faint rays breaking through the darkness of the street lamp. He stared at it, his throat tightening. When the bus stopped near the glass towers downtown, Henry stepped off with the sketch still in his hand. Marvin watched through the mirror, muttering a prayer he hadn't said in years. Claire's office tower loomed above him, sleek and cold. He felt small in its shadow, a man out of place. The security guard eyed him suspiciously as he entered the lobby, his boots leaving wet prints on the polished floor. But when Henry gave Claire's name, the guard's demeanor shifted instantly. She's expecting you, he said, gesturing toward the elevator. The ride up felt endless. His reflection in the mirrored walls mocked him, creased clothes, tired eyes, a man who didn't belong in places like this anymore. But when the door slid open, Claire was waiting, jacket still draped neatly over her arm. Henry, she said with a warmth that startled him. You came. He shifted uneasily, not sure why. Because you still believe tomorrow might exist, she answered softly. She led him into her office. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city. Models of buildings lined the shelves, blueprints stacked on the table. This was her world, built on power and precision. Henry wanted to run. I looked you up, Claire admitted, motioning for him to sit. I know what you built. Schools, hospitals, homes. You were one of the best. That was another life, Henry said bitterly. I don't even recognize that man anymore. Claire leaned forward. Maybe you don't, but I do. He swallowed hard, his hands tightening around Sophia's sketch. I'm not offering charity, Claire continued. I'm offering a chance. There's a project at community center. We need someone who understands not just numbers, but people. Someone who's built for families, not just for profit. Want you on it. Henry's laugh was hollow. I don't even have an address. I sleep in a truck behind a warehouse. Claire didn't flinch. Then this is where it changes. Take the chance, Henry. Show up tomorrow like you belong because you do. For a long moment, silence pressed between them. Henry's heart hammered. He wanted to believe her, but the years of rejection weighed on him. Finally, he asked the question clawing at him. Why me? Claire looked him straight in the eye. Because you gave me warmth when you had none. Because you reminded me what matters. And because the world forgot you, but I won't. Henry lowered his head, overwhelmed. The sketch trembled in his hands. He thought of Noah, his son, the promise he had whispered. Just for now. I'll come back for you. Claire reached across the desk, placing the jacket between them. This belongs to you, but so does tomorrow. Henry lifted his eyes, something stirring deep inside. Fear, hope, defiance, he couldn't name it. But he knew this much. The world had cracked open, and he stood at the edge of something he couldn't yet see. Behind the glass walls, the city roared on, blind to the man sitting at the desk. But for Henry, the storm inside him was finally shifting. The crossroads was here, and somewhere across the city. Sophia closed her sketchbook with a satisfied smile, whispering, "Don't disappear." Asterisk morning broke sharp and bright, the kind of winter light that cut like glass. Henry stood outside the tower where Claire's firm lived, his hands shaking as he adjusted the collar of his old shirt. He had washed it in the library bathroom sink, dried it overnight on the heater vent in the truck, and prayed it looked presentable. It was all he had. In his folder sat the resumes, lit from too many rejections, and tucked inside them was Sophia's sketch. He had looked at it again and again through the night, as though the girl's pencil lines were more armor than paper. The revolving doors groaned as he stepped inside. His boots clacked awkwardly on the polished floor, echoing loud in the marble lobby. The receptionist gave him a quick glance, then another, eyes flicking from his tired suit to the name on her computer. When she saw Claire Reynolds had signed him impersonally, her tone changed instantly. Top floor, Mr. Miles. She's expecting you. Henry's heart thudded as the elevator climbed. Each floor that passed felt like years peeling back. The engineer he once was, the man who kissed his wife's forehead goodnight, the father who promised his son better days. The doors opened, and sunlight spilled in from the floor to ceiling windows. Claire was waiting, a calm presence in a storm he couldn't control. You came, she said softly, almost like she had doubted he would. I don't know what I'm doing here, Henry admitted. Just be who you are, she replied. That's enough. She led him into a boardroom where models of buildings stood like silent witnesses. Around the long table, a half-dozen partners looked up, men in suits, women with eyes sharp as glass. Henry froze. He didn't belong in this world anymore. He could already feel their judgment pressing against him like weight on his chest. But Claire's voice steadied the room. This is Henry Miles, she said firmly. He built structures you've walked through without ever knowing his name. Today, you'll know it. There were murmurs, raised brows, skeptical looks. One man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. With respect, Ms. Reynolds, why bring in someone who hasn't worked in years? Henry swallowed. His throat felt raw. He almost sat down, almost stayed silent. Then he thought of Marvin's words knock on the door, or freeze forever. He thought of Sophia's sketch, the eyes she had given him, lit with a flicker of fire. And he thought of Noah, his son, waiting somewhere for his father to keep a promise. Henry stood straighter, because buildings aren't just concrete and steel. He said, his voice rough but steady, they're bones for lives. I built hospitals where kids laughed in hallways while their parents whispered prayers. I built schools where children painted the walls with futures they hadn't yet imagined. And I kept showing up even when my own world collapsed. His hand trembled as he placed the sketch on the table. Someone reminded me I still matter, and I do. The room was silent, not out of pity, but because his words rang with something deeper truth. The kind you couldn't manufacture in polished resumes or PowerPoint slides. Claire's eyes glistened as she slid the sketch closer to her colleagues. This is how the world sees him, she said. Not forgotten, not finished, just waiting for a chance. The man who had questioned Henry leaned forward, studying the drawing. His jaw softened. This is your daughter's work, he asked, glancing at Claire. Claire shook her head. No, a bus driver's daughter. A girl who's never met Henry, but saw him anyway. And then the door opened. Marvin stepped inside, Sophia by his side. Claire had invited them, believing Henry needed witnesses who truly knew him. Sophia clutched her sketchbook to her chest, eyes wide as she looked at Henry in person for the first time. "That's him," she whispered. Stepping closer, she opened the book to show the final sketch, the man under the streetlight, but now with rays of light breaking the darkness. Strength in his stance, hope burning in his gaze. Henry's knees nearly buckled. He had never seen himself like that, not even in Lily's eyes when she was alive. Claire placed a hand on the table. "I asked them here because this isn't about business. It's about remembering what we're building for." Henry understands. That in a way most of us have forgotten. The partners exchanged looks. One by one, heads nodded. Not all, but enough. Double quotes, "Mr. Miles," the chairman said finally, "welcome back." The words hit Henry harder than any blow, harder than the cold nights in the truck, harder than every rejection letter combined. His chest heaved, and for a moment he thought he might collapse, but then Marvin's hand gripped his shoulder, steady and sure. Sophia smiled shyly, her eyes bright with belief, and Claire stood tall beside him, jacket draped over her arm like a banner. Later, as the meeting broke, Claire pressed the jacket back into Henry's hands. "You gave me warmth when you had none," she whispered. "Now I give it back, but you won't eat it the same way anymore." Henry pulled it over his shoulders, the familiar fabric heavy, but this time it didn't feel like survival. It felt like armor. He stepped out of the tower into the winter air, no longer shivering. The city roared around him, blind to the man, walking its streets, but for Henry, everything had changed. The promise to Noah, the fire in Sophia's sketch, the belief in Claire's eyes tomorrow, wasn't just a word anymore. It was waiting. And as Marvin's bus rolled past, headlights cutting through the morning light, Henry raised a hand. Marvin honked once, smiling through the glass. The man who had been invisible was no longer unseen. The world had noticed. The man at the bus stop had disappeared into the storm once, but now he was walking back into the light.